We are recording. Still got about 20 minutes until class starts, but so if you're watching this video, you can skip ahead about 20 minutes, or you can watch this part. I'm going to show how to insert a graph. Obviously, I'm going to bring up this lab worksheet. The first question is, did you do a graph did you draw a graph or did you do it electronically?
I was trying to do both, but I ended up drawing.
Okay. Oh, yeah, so in that case, it's basically just inserting a picture. So have you taken a picture, you've taken a picture and the picture's on your computer, right?
Well, let me get my flash drive out. But yes.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, all right. So if you have the picture, on your hard drive, because you did it by hand, you took the picture,
Mhm.
you can just, select the box right there. Then you go to Insert, Image, Upload from Computer, and then you just, wherever it is on your computer, you
Put
just
it in
upload.
right there. Let me try that. Thank you. Cause
Knock on wood, that's the way it should go. It doesn't mean it always will, because you know how electronics are.
yeah.
If it can go wrong, it will. It's been my experience.
The stapler was messing up with me at the library, and then she was like, "It really." I said, "Electronics, I don't any type of if I gotta, it's always a battle. I don't know what it is with me and electronics.
Same.
I don't know. I got too much electricity in my body, and it makes it haywire or something." The people thought I was playing until they was like, "Ooh," and I was like, "Yeah." Let's see. Okay. That's the same.
Oh, because you need to open up the lab first.
Okay, because I was like, what does this mean that's past due?
Oh, it is, it's past due.
But I thought I submitted it, no?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. No, I guess you haven't yet, but that's okay. It's the first lab. I'm not worried about it. But first, before you upload it, you need to, like you were saying, bring up the document itself, and then put
I
the.
did do that. No, you get on my nerves. Okay, let
Well,
me,
that's the first lab. Once you learn that one, the rest of it should be easy sailing.
I'm like, I didn't even see that it said that. Okay. I'll have one.
Morning.
Good morning.
The Mankins?
Yes, sir.
if you can't find your pre-lab,
Yeah, it goes, there it goes.
it might be, or it should be, at least on your Google Drive.
And I looked under there. I tried to save everything.
Yep, we're gonna hit that.
That's what I just did.
Yeah, I don't see the picture. Right, is that it? Yep, there it is, right? PDF. Interesting.
Yeah.
This is so weird. It's also weird that it's saved as a PDF instead of like,
Yes, but even with, so the
That's weird.
pre-lab, right, this is, there,
but yeah, you shouldn't be able to upload that because it's a Word document.
oh.
So you can't really upload.
So redo it and try to submit it again, because when I go to my,
Yeah, basically, you need to, just take another picture of your graph is my suggestion.
so this is what I have for my recent.
Yeah. So how did you, like, when you did the graph, how'd you get it on your computer?
Ended up emailing it to me from the
Interesting.
library.
Oh, well, maybe that's why. I don't know. Maybe just take a picture of it with your phone.
And try, yeah, because I lost my phone this day.
Oh, man, that
I
stinks.
gotta try to find another with this.
Oh,
thing.
no, that stinks. Or if you have it on you, you could just give it to me in this situation, since you lost your phone and all that.
Yes, I do have it.
I'll just
But
take that.
But I really, you can tell, like, I really did it. That's
Yeah,
why
yeah.
the time was on there, and so for it not to say,
Yeah, usually I think that's probably the easiest way is, once you get your phone again, just take a picture of it, email it to yourself.
it inserted.
Yep. Thanks.
And I did fix the question. I thought you even graded my pre-lab.
Pre-lab, yes, but the lab is past due now. Actually, I'm gonna update this announcements reminders. So the pre-lab was due
Oh, right,
last Friday, and then the
Yes.
lab itself was due
Wednesday.
Wednesday, and then,
And I did turn it in late. I did everything on Friday, so I wasn't expecting my lab to be done properly on Wednesday, because I
Right.
had to leave or whatever. But
oh,
I
yeah,
sat down Thursday and did all of it. So I'm gonna redo it today. I know it's gonna be submitted late, but I
That's
just
okay.
wanna let you know I was not, it's like, oh, I'll get to it. No.
okay.
I don't want nothing piling up.
And if you've already done it, it should be easy, because if you've done it, you
I
don't need
should
to
have
redo it, you should just be able to submit it.
I
So
just-
you've got the file somewhere.
I do got it somewhere. I
Yeah,
just,
should be on your Google Docs, and that's one of the reasons
yeah, because
Use
everything
Google
else
Docs.
usually on here, but I'm gonna figure it out. But hopefully I find it. Thank you.
Is it Mathis?
Yep.
All right. Morning.
Morning.
Jeremiah?
Yeah.
All right. Elkins, right? Okay. All right. Got about a minute left, so I'll go ahead and get started. I'll do the announcements and reminders because there's nothing new. Well, for the most part, there's nothing new. Let's see. Thank you. Nope. Case Bowles. Right here. Oh, all right. Tristan. Covington's here. DeVere. Not here. Dow. Oh, Dow is here. Hughes. Lebdy. Carlos here. Mankins is here. Oops, yeah, Mankins is here. Mathis is here. Rains? Yep. I think that's everybody. Rains is here. Reed is not here. Elise is not here. Thompson's not here. Withrow is not here. Ian Dewey's not here. Elkins is here. That's everybody. All right. Let's get started really quickly with announcements and reminders. Oops. Go. There we go. Oh, there we go. How did I do that? There we go. Yeah, so as a reminder, Lab 1 is now past due. You need to upload that to Mile 9 if you haven't already. It's the first lab, so I'm very easygoing as far as the due dates are concerned for the first lab. Same thing for the pre-lab. The pre-lab for this week is now past due. I'm a little bit behind, so once we're done with this and I go to office hours, I'm going to start grading everything from over the weekend. So as long as you have it turned in before I get around to grading it, I'm going to consider that on time this week. Make sure you get it done, because if you don't, you can't come to lab, and that's 20 points that are gone. So any questions about labs in general? All right, and as a reminder, there's videos, these 2 videos you need to watch for the pre-lab for this week, and answer some questions while you're watching them. So make sure you do that. Quiz 1 is technically past due. Again, it's the first one, so I'm a little bit loosey-goosey with the due dates. So if you missed your chance to take quiz 1, send me an email, and I'll open it back up for you. Again, like I already said, I'm catching up. I didn't do any work this weekend, so I have a lot of grading to do. Independent work is now dropped back down to 17 points per page. Hopefully you see a trend there, right? Eventually it's going to get back down to what it says in the syllabus, which is 10 points per page. So now's your time to write some papers. And remember, there is no minimum or maximum. You could write a paper that's 2 sentences long, right? Just send in some papers. Do you guys have any questions or announcements? Anything you want to share with everybody else? All right, let's jump back into it then. We were talking about, let me back up. We talked about chemistry. Last thing we were talking about was chemical reactions, right? We started talking about chemical reactions. We talked about how reactants are always on the left, products are always on the right, at least in this course. And that the arrow is always pointing away from the reactants and to the products. We talked about how we can't create or destroy matter, we can only rearrange it. And I gave you this example of hydrogen peroxide turning into water and oxygen. And to remind you that was just an example, so nothing to memorize there. So let's talk about the different types of reactions. and the different type of bonds, right? So when we have these chemical reactions, these atoms come together and form molecules, right? They come together and we have these different types of bonds, and you will need to know the different types of bonds for the exam. So the first type you need to know is called ionic bonds. And an ionic bond is when an atom loses or gains electrons to fill the outer ring. And when they do that, they become electrically charged. So to remind you what we talked about last week on Friday, it's all, as far as we're concerned, it's all about the electrons, right? It's all about trying to get that full outer ring, their outermost ring, they want to be full with electrons. So in this particular case, they either give them up or they take them. When they give them up, when you get rid of something that's negative, you become positive, and that's called a cation. It's right here, cation. So again, once an atom gives up an electron, it becomes positive, or at least one electron. It could sometimes give up more than that. But when you give up electrons, you become positive, and that's called a cation. Meanwhile, something's going to take that electron, and when you gain an electron, you become negative. And that is an anion. You need to know all four of these terms for the exam. You need to know what ions are, cations, anions, and of course, when you put them together, you have an ionic bond. The first word for attendance, and of course, for you guys in person, you don't have to send these words, but you can for extra credit. But if you're watching the video or if you're streaming right now, you have to send those words to get credit. And the first word is bond. I know that's plural, but the first word for attendance is bond. So any questions about what an ionic bond is before I show you a picture of an ionic bond? All right, so here's a picture from the old textbook. Here we have a sodium ion. You can see right here it has 1, 2, 3, 4. Whoops. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sorry, that's not the outermost shell. That's full. But its outermost shell only has 1 electron, right? And keep in mind, like I said earlier, what you need to know is that the inner shell, as you can see right here, holds 2 electrons. And as far as we're concerned in this class, every other shell past that holds 8. So that sodium needs a full outer ring. In this case, since it only has 1 on the outermost ring, it's easier to give 1 up than to take 7. Does that make sense? Like it's easier to say, hey, take my extra. Because once it gets rid of that, then it has that, that's then the outermost ring right there, and it's full, right? So it's easier for it to give 1 up. The chlorine, meanwhile, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons. And again, it needs 8, right, to be full. So it just takes that 1 from sodium. It's a good exchange, right? Sodium needs to give 1 up. Chlorine needs to take 1. They do that, and then we have sodium chloride. And of course, I'll put a big old X through that, indicating that that's just an example. I'm probably not going to ask you any questions about sodium chloride. But yeah, that's how it works. And you can see, because this sodium gave up its electron, it is now positive. And because that chloride, well, it's chloride now, it used to be called chlorine, when it took that electron, it became negative. And obviously, negative and positive things attract to each other. That's why they're bonded, like 2 magnets almost. So are there any questions about that? All right, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click this little animation here and see what I just showed you, but animated. So that's it for ionic bonds. The next one is covalent bonds. And before we talk about that, let's talk about what this word means. So first of all, like if someone were to tell you they're cohabitating with somebody else, what do you think that means?
Bonding.
The what?
Living together, like, yeah.
Living together, right? But what if somebody's co-parenting? It's like usually in my mind, that's a divorced couple, but they're still like doing all the parenting together, right? So they're sharing the parental responsibilities. Cohabitating, like you said, is when someone's sharing a place to live. So here too, when you think of covalent, you should be thinking of sharing. We'll get to that in a second. Term I haven't taught you yet. Of course, if you've done the pre-lab, you should be familiar with this already. But valent, right? So I don't think I mentioned this last week, but like I said, like the first ring holds 2 electrons. All the other rings, as far as we're concerned, hold 8. So the outermost ring, I don't remember if I said this or not, but that's called the valence ring. That's your valence ring. So covalent basically just means you're sharing electrons in the outermost ring. So what you need to know for the exam is a covalent bond is when atoms share one or more pairs of electrons. Any questions about that? So again, in this case, they're not giving electrons up or taking them, like we talked about in ionic bonds. They're sharing them. And just so you know, this will be important later in the semester, a covalent bond is stronger than an ionic bond. As a matter of fact, as far as we're concerned, covalent bond is the strongest bond. And again, you will need to know that. Not necessarily because it's going to be a test question, because I don't remember if it is or not, but that will be important later in the semester. Covalent bonds are the strongest of the bonds that I'm going to teach you. Yes, they're also the most common, but I'm not worried about that. You don't need to know that for the exam. Also, if you forget that they're the most common, that'll be fine too, because you don't need to know that to understand the other stuff I'm going to teach you. Technically, when these things come together, that's called a molecule. I'm going to put a question mark next to that too, because I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you that. And again, once again, just like the ionic bond, they're still trying to fill the outermost electron shell, right? That's what it's all about. Trying to get that full 8 rings or 2, depending on the situation. So again, they're sharing electrons. They're not giving away electrons. They're not taking them. They're sharing them. And there's 2 types. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to ask you this, but your book mentioned it, so will I. The 2 types of covalent bonds are nonpolar bonds, and that's when electrons are shared equally. And of course, actually, I'll let you guess. If that's one of the 2 types, what do you think the other type is?
Polar.
Yeah, polar, right? Good. Polar. That's when the electrons are not shared equally, and we'll talk about that. So that second one's going to be a little bit more important. But as far as questions on the exam are concerned, I'm not going to ask you the 2 different types of covalent bonds. But again, we will talk about polar bonds a little bit later. So are there any questions about covalent bonds before I give you an example of covalent bonds? All right, and again, I'll remind you, these are all great independent work topics, right? So here I'm telling you the book definition of covalent bond. Here I'm telling you the book definition of a molecule. Here I'm telling you the 2 different types of covalent bonds. And for independent work, again, you can just look it up and say, according to the textbook, here's the definition of covalent bond. According to this source, here's the definition of covalent bond. And then just write a sentence or 2 where you compare and contrast the 2. How are they the same? How are they different? Anyway, let me give you an example. You're going to get really familiar with this one in lab. Carbon is a great example. It has an atomic number of 6, and this is good. This will help you for lab. If it has an atomic number of 6, that means, this is a refresher for what we learned last week, that means it has 6 protons, right? By definition, its atomic number is the number of protons it has, right? So carbon happens to have the atomic number of 6, therefore we know it has 6 protons. Since I haven't said anything about it being charged, right? It's not positive or negative in this particular case. So therefore it must have 6 electrons, right? Because the electrons need to balance out the protons. So if there's 6 electrons, if you were to draw it, you draw the first ring, fill 2 in on the first ring. You draw the second ring. Remember, you're trying to get to 8, but you don't have 8, right? You only have 6 total. You've already used 2 on the inner. Therefore, you only have 4 on the outside. Therefore, you need 4 more to fill that outer ring. Therefore, it will bond 4 times. So everything I just told you, well, first of all, let's put it next to it. It's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about carbon on the exam. But this is the process you're going to use to do this week's lab, that one table. Hopefully you've already looked at it. There's a table where you get an element. It tells you the atomic number, and you're supposed to figure everything else out. So remember, again, once you know the atomic number, then you know the number of protons. And unless it's charged, and they're not in that in the lab, once you know the number of protons, therefore you know the number of electrons. Then you can figure out how many are in the innermost ring, how many are in the outermost ring. Then you can figure out how many more electrons it needs to be filled. And once you know that, then that's the same number. That's how many times it will bond. Generally speaking, as far as we're concerned in this class, that's the case. There are exceptions. You can look them up for independent work if you want, but as far as we're concerned, that's how it works. Any questions about how that works? All right, here's some pictures. I don't think this one's from your textbook. I think this is from the older one, but I like to include it. So these are all the same thing. We're looking at formaldehyde, which is drawn in different ways. You can see the electron configuration drawing here, the structural formula, the space filling model, the ball and stick model. You don't need to know any of these things. The point is that there's different ways of drawing molecules. So if you see things, like you're studying, I don't know, for some reason you might, if you're studying formaldehyde and you're familiar with this look of it, and then you see that, it is the same thing. Also, just so you know, this is what you will be drawing in lab. So there's a part of this week's lab where you're gonna have to draw molecules. As a matter of fact, if you want to, you can go ahead and get started on that. That's up to you. I'm gonna teach you how to do this in lab, but yeah, this is the type of drawing you're gonna do. So, and again, we put a big old X through here. This formaldehyde is just an example. I'm not gonna ask you any questions about formaldehyde. You don't need to memorize any of this. So, anyway, any questions about that? All right, once again, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on this. It's a little animation that shows you everything I just showed you. And let's talk about the third and final type of bond, hydrogen bonds. Before we talk about hydrogen bonds, you need a little bit of back information, a little bit of information about polar molecules. Like we mentioned earlier, a polar molecule, excuse me, we didn't technically say that. We were talking about a polar covalent bond, right? So when you have a polar covalent bond, that molecule that's in that polar covalent bond is a polar molecule. And you definitely need to know this. A polar molecule is when you have an uneven sharing of electrons. Definitely need to know that. It'll definitely be on the exam, and you need to understand that concept to understand some things later in the semester. So polar molecule has an uneven sharing of electrons. I don't know how good your eyesight is, but can anybody tell me what the atomic number of oxygen is? And hydrogen too, while you're at it. It's back there. It's nothing you need to memorize, but can you see it? 8? Yep. So the atomic number of oxygen is 8. What about hydrogen? 1. Very good. So oxygen has 8 electrons. Hydrogen has 1 electron. Excuse me, protons. Good grief. Oxygen has, well, that's also true, but anyway, oxygen has 8 protons, hydrogen has 1 proton. It should be 1 proton. If you're an electron, you're negative, so you're attracted to protons, right? So if you were an electron, would you rather be near oxygen or hydrogen? Think about that. Electrons are attracted to protons. So if you're an electron, would you rather be near hydrogen with its 1 proton or oxygen with its 8 protons?
Oxygen.
Good, very good, oxygen. And for that reason, oxygen, like in this water molecule, for example, has a slight negative charge, and the hydrogens have a slight positive charge. There's actually a particular symbol you're supposed to draw, because it's not fully, the oxygen is not fully negative, and the hydrogens aren't fully positive, but they're partially negative and partially positive, because again, the electrons, they're not shared equally. The electrons want to be near the oxygen. So any questions so far? We're still going to talk about hydrogen bonds, but any questions about how polar molecules work and why they're polar and why the electrons are not shared equally? All right. So this results in a weak attraction that we call hydrogen bonds. So this is between 2 different molecules. What we see here is just 1 molecule, so that's a bad picture. So there's no hydrogen bonds on that slide. You can't see any hydrogen bonds because that's just 1 molecule, excuse me. That's just 1 water molecule. And water molecules are held together by a covalent bond. And again, like I showed you earlier, because oxygen has so many protons, the electrons like to hang out on that side of it. Therefore, that part of the molecule is slightly negative, and again, the hydrogens are slightly positive. Another thing you definitely need to know for the exam and to understand some concepts later in the semester is that hydrogen bonds are the weakest of the bonds. Because again, they're not giving away electrons or sharing electrons, right? That's an ionic bond. And an ionic bond, like we talked about earlier, is when things have a full charge, right? So they're fully positive, fully negative, so they're stuck together for that reason. And the one we talked about previously was, or prior to this, was covalent bonds, where they're sharing electrons, right? That's a very strong bond because they're sharing electrons. Here, they're doing neither of those. They're not sharing electrons. They didn't give up any electrons. They didn't take any electrons. So they're not fully positive or fully negative, but they're partially positive and partially negative. And that's why they're the weakest of the bonds. We always talk about water as the example, but there are also other examples. You can look them up for independent work if you want. Give me some examples of some hydrogen bonds in biology, other than water. Oh, also, just so you know, I'll show you a picture of this. There will definitely be a test question, 2 test questions. One is going to say, what kind of bond holds one water molecule together? So if we're talking about one water molecule, the answer is covalent bond, right? So it's a covalent bond that's keeping this oxygen attached to those 2 hydrogens.
How did you work that?
What type, well, I don't remember verbatim how it's going to be on the exam, but basically, what type of bond holds a water molecule together? Then there'll be another question that says, what type of bond holds water molecules, plural, together? So we're not talking about one molecule anymore. We're talking about these multiple water molecules. What's keeping them together? That is a hydrogen bond. So don't let that trick you. It seems like a trick question, but it's not, which is why I'm bringing it up. So I'm telling you now, you're going to have 2 different questions. They're very similar, so don't let it trick you. I'm not trying to trick you. So any questions about hydrogen bonds? All right, let's talk about matter. This is not from the textbook. This is from the old textbook. You definitely don't need to know this, but there are 92 naturally occurring elements. That old textbook gave those 4 as an example. You don't need to memorize that. Each symbol is derived from an English, Latin, or German name. I'll give you I'll put an X exact to, again, indicating I'm not going to ask you any of these questions on the exam. But here's what you do need to know. Pay attention to this, because like I said, I like to test out of the textbook for this 100 level class. But this is something that's not in the textbook, but I'm requiring you to know it. So pay attention. There are 25 elements that are essential to humans. You need to know that number, 25 essential elements. And again, this is not in the textbook, but it is the PowerPoint. You need to know that there's 25 essential elements. You also need to know what I call the big 4. So of all the elements, of all the 92 naturally occurring elements, these 4 make up the most, or represented the most. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. What you don't need to know is that all 4 collectively make up about 96%. I'm telling you that, but you don't necessarily need to know it. I'm not going to ask you that number. But again, you do need to know that there's 25 essential elements, and that these are the big 4: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. I don't even care if you know that in that order. It does not matter what order it's in. Later in this PowerPoint, I'm going to put them in a particular order, but I'm not going to require you to remember that. So again, the big 4, about 96% of you is all oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. So that means there's 21 other elements, right, making up the other 4%. So obviously, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen are very important. And you'll learn about them in lab. You'll probably get sick of them this week in lab. Because like I said earlier, you're going to draw a lot of molecules. And almost all of them have all 4 of those in there. Anyway, any questions about that slide? I'm going to give you some examples. Again, this is not from your textbook, but these are just examples. So what I'm about to show you will not be on the exam. So again, about 96% is the big 4. So then that means we have about 4% of the other. Most of that 4% is made up of 7 elements. So remember, there's 25 total. And we have the big 4. So that leaves us with 21 more, right? And of those 21, we have 7 that I'm talking about right now. And you can look this up for independent work. So calcium is an example, phosphorus. You can look up any of them and find out, first of all, why are they important and where do we find them? So for example, calcium is important for bones and teeth. Where do we find it? Dairy products, sardines, green leafy vegetables. Phosphorus, why is it important? It's part of our DNA, among other things. Where do we get it? In our diet, we get it in eggs, beans, and nuts. So again, for independent work, you can look up the other 7 elements You could just list them if you want, right? I looked it up, according to this source, here's the other 7 elements. Or, again, you could write about them. Where do we get them in our diet? Why are they important? But again, not going to be a test question, so put a big old X for that. Any questions about that? All right, so again, 25 elements in our bodies. We talked about the big 4. Here's 7, but there's still even, that doesn't make up all of them. Then we have something called trace elements. You need to know what a trace element is. You don't need to know that there's 14 of them. But you need to know that trace elements make up, well, you don't even need to know that number, but just so you know, they make up less than 0.01% of your weight. So there's 14 elements in your body that are like minuscule. There's barely any of them in there. You don't need to, again, you don't necessarily need to memorize that number. Just remember it's a very small amount. And this is what I hinted at when we first started this chapter. People try to scare you and tell you truths, but in a scary way, trying to scare you about chemicals. So there's a lot of things, I mean, anything's a poison depending on the dose, but especially for trace elements, right? Because we need very little of them. So that's an interesting thing to me. If you think about iodine, right? We need iodine as an example. I'll put it next to that because I'm not going to ask you about it. We need iodine, but we can't have too much of it. So we need it to live. If we have too much of it, it's a poison. Just like fluoride, right? So right now they're talking about getting rid of fluoride out of the water system because they said fluoride is a toxin. And it is a toxin because if you have too much of it, it's toxic. But you need it, right? So almost everything we talk about in this chapter, all these chemicals, they are essential. You need them. But just like anything, the dose makes the poison. If you have too much of it, it'll kill you. Speaking of which, that's a good independent work topic too. Look up anything you can think of and find out what the deadly dose is. Water will kill you. If you have too much water, it will kill you. Look that up for independent work. How much water would it take to kill you? Of course, if you breathe it, it doesn't take much. I mean, people have died from drinking too much water. Anyway, yeah, fluorine is just an example. The guy probably didn't have much fluorine, but it doesn't matter. He looks very happy. This is another good example too. Sorry. So the next word for attendance is going to be cereal. And this is a picture from a cereal box. But anyway, I should share these 2 videos with you. There's people on YouTube who talk about this. One of them is trying to scare you through chemophobia, is what I call it. They're trying to scare you. So there is iron in your cereal. They are putting iron in your cereal because we need iron to live. Without iron in our red blood cells, we can't carry oxygen, we'd be dead. You need iron, right? That's where you get it from cereal, red meat, things like that, right? You need it. So yes, they're putting literal iron in your cereal. And yes, it is iron like you would think of a metal, right? So what some people have done, one person did it like as a little demonstration, like a cool science demonstration, like, look at this. He puts the cereal in the blender, he puts some water in there, then blends it up so it's one homogeneous mix, and then he holds a magnet to it, to the side of the blender, and sure enough, the iron is attached to the magnet. So you can see the iron in the cereal. And that's a really cool demonstration. And then there's a video of somebody doing the same thing, but they're trying to scare you. They're putting iron and they're putting metal. There's metal in your cereal, trying to scare you with it. And they do the same thing. Look, I've got this magnet. Look, there's actual metal in there. But yes, there is metal in there. They're doing it on purpose because you need it. But anyway, yeah. So that's one example. Again, the dose makes the poison. And yes, we need iron for one example. Another example here, iodized salt. If you ever wondered where they got that name, it's because people have put iodine in your salt because we need iodine. Right? So anyway, those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. If you download PowerPoint, you can click there and watch a video. One of the videos I was telling you about with the whole magnet thing, that's one of them. I don't remember which one it is. But anyway, yeah. People are going to try to scare you. And they'll say, oh, you know, they've got this chemical is the same ingredient in this cleaning product or whatever. People are dumb. Very dumb. How many of you have ever heard of dihydrogen monoxide? One, a couple. So dihydrogen monoxide is just another way of saying water. And there's a whole Facebook page dedicated to the humor of people who are afraid of dihydrogen monoxide because it's a chemical name, so everybody's scared of it. I'll tell you this too, and you can look this up, fact check me if you want. Everyone who's ever had dihydrogen monoxide died eventually. You guys will eventually die, and you had dihydrogen monoxide. Anyway, so again, here's all these elements we're talking about. This is good for you to look at, but you don't need to memorize this. You do need to know the big four, which are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. You don't need to know them in that order. You don't need to know these percentages. You just need to know that those are the big four. And remember, past the big four, right, that makes up about, what I say, 96%. So about most of the other 4% is right there. And of course, the rest are these trace elements that we just got finished talking about. And again, you do not need to memorize any of this other than the fact, other than the big four. You need to know the big four. So any questions about that? Excuse me. Again, great independent work topic, right? How much sodium is too much sodium? How much is not enough? Chromium, like how much chromium do we need? How do our bodies use chromium? Where do we get chromium in our diet? All these things you can look up for independent work. And again, the dose makes the poison. So yes, a lot of these things, like think about that. Look at some of this stuff on this list that you need in your life, but people could scare you. Like, there's silicone. There's silicone in that food that you're eating. But yeah, well maybe, but you need a little bit of it, right? Anyway, that's it for 2.1. We're now in the middle section of the chapter. It's 2.2. It's all about water. I know this is hard for you to read, but there's one learning objective to this section. Man, that is hard to read. I'll read it to you. You should, by the end of this, you should be able to describe the properties of water that are critical to maintaining life. So basically, you're going to learn why water is so important for life and also how it works. So here we go. Not that you need to know, but this is a good introduction. It's not in your textbook, it's from the old textbook. But life, as far as we know it, began in water. The life on Earth, as far as we know, started in water, not on land. And it was there for 3 billion years before finally making its way to land. And because of that, and other reasons that you're about to learn, life is still tied to water. And we can't have life without water. As far as we know, there is no life without water. Which is why, for example, they're looking for water, such a big effort to find water on Mars. Because without water, there's no life. So once you find water, it's like, oh, there's a possibility that there could be life. Here's a number you do need to know. Your cells are about 70 to 95% water. So think about that. That's like that means you, right? Because you are just a bunch of cells. You are mostly water, like a large majority is water. So you do need to know that number. So I'll circle it. By the way, I put a little star next to that to remind myself to tell you that's the average human cell is 70 to 95%. And that's a big gap, right? A big difference. 70 to 95 is a big difference. So you could look that up for independent work. Pick any type of cell you want and look it up. Like brain cell, kidney cell, sperm, egg, right? Skin cell. Whatever it is, look up the cell and find out what percentage of it is water on average. Because again, this is the average human cell. And there's all kinds of cells in your body, right? So, another thing, not only are you made up mostly of water, but so is the Earth, right? Earth is mostly water. Well, the surface of the Earth is mostly water. And it's this abundance of water that makes Earth habitable. We'll talk about all of these things coming up. So any questions so far? Again, as far as the exam is concerned, for this slide, the only important thing right there is 70 to 95%. And again, I don't think this is in your textbooks. This is one of those few times where I'm testing outside of the textbook. Anyway, and again, another independent work topic. I'm telling you it's 70 to 95% water. You can look up a different source and write a paper about it. According to your PowerPoint, cells are about 70 to 95% water. According to this source, cells are this percentage of water. So let's talk about it. It's the polarity in the hydrogen bonds that explain most of water's life-supporting properties. So it's all about that fact that they're polar molecules and have these hydrogen bonds we talked about earlier. Almost everything we talk about when it comes to water boils down to that fact. There's 4 properties. You need to know them. We're going to talk about them separately. Water is cohesive. We'll talk about that. Water is very good at moderating temperature. We'll talk about that. Ice floats, as you know. I'm sure you know that, but there's an actual biological significance of that. We'll talk about that. And then also water is a very good solvent, meaning it's very good at dissolving stuff. We'll talk about that separately too. But here we go, let's jump into it. First, we'll talk about the cohesion of water. Water molecules stick together because of hydrogen bonding, right? You already knew that. We talked about hydrogen bonding, and water was the example I gave. Which also brings up another good infant work topic. What are some other molecules that bond with hydrogen bonds that aren't water? But anyway, yes, so water molecules stick together. That's what cohesion means. When something's cohesive, that's when 2 things stick together and they're the same type of thing. As opposed to adhesion, which is when 2 different things stick together. Right? So if I put a Post-it note on this wall, that would be adhesion, because it's a Post-it note and a wall, 2 different things. When you put 2 things that are together, the same together, that's called cohesion. Molecules of the same kind sticking together. You need to know that for the exam. And it is stronger for water than it is most other liquids. I'll give one example, not that you need to know this, but rubbing alcohol is a good example. What happens when you put rubbing alcohol on your skin? What's it feel like? Okay, let me rephrase that. Yeah, if you put it on your skin, but you don't have I don't know why you would do this, but if you put it on your skin and you don't have like a wound, how does it feel? Cold, right? Yes. And the reason it feels cold is because even though there is hydrogen bonding in rubbing alcohol, it's not as much hydrogen bonding as water. So what's basically happening, and I know this sounds counterintuitive, but it's basically boiling off your skin, because its boiling point is a lot lower than water. And in your mind, you're probably thinking boiling is hot, because water's hot when it boils, but not for alcohol. So it just evaporates right off. And because of that, that's what gives you the cold feeling, because it's evaporating off. Because it doesn't have as much hydrogen bonding as water, right? So they're not stuck together as much. So it doesn't take much energy for it to just evaporate off your skin. Unlike water, right? Water has very strong hydrogen bonds. Well, I won't say that. Has more hydrogen bonds than most other molecules. Therefore, it's stuck together. Now, why is that important for life? Well, the big example that the textbook gives is trees. Like, think about that. Think about a tree that's hundreds of feet tall. You ever wonder, like, how did the water get up there? It's coming from the roots. Even when it rains, right? It's not like the leaves are catching the water and using the water, right? They don't get it that way. They get it from the roots. So even a tree that's hundreds of feet tall, they're getting their water from the roots. So how does it get up there? And that's what we're about to talk about. This picture's not from your textbook, it's from the other one. But yeah, it's because of this cohesive nature of water. So what happens is, as those leaves and different cells in the tree use the water, or they evaporate, they're still attached to each other, right? It's like a chain reaction. So as one leaves, it pulls the rest up because they're attracted to each other. Matter of fact, if you were to get a balloon, and rub it, like it's slightly different. It's kind of the same. If you were to get a balloon and rub it so it has an electrical charge and put it next to running water, the water might lean towards it because of an electron difference, right? It's attracted to it. And same here. Here, they're attracted to each other. So when one water molecule leaves, it brings the rest with it, and that's how that works. So again, cohesive nature of water, one of the life-giving attributes it has. Any questions about that? There's another reason that the cohesion is important. It's a little bit less important, but surface tension. Surface tension is the measure of difficulty in stretching or breaking the surface of a liquid. And because these water molecules are hydrogen bonded to each other, more so than most other liquids, the water has a high surface tension, which again is slightly important for life, but not as important as the tree example. Because not everything walks on water like that spider. Anyway, any questions about surface tension? Here's a picture from I don't remember what that was. Well, I don't remember which Olympics. Maybe 2016. I don't know. Anyway, and it's kind of hard for you to see, but that's a swimmer, and this is actually the water line right here. So the swimmer is above the water line, but still under the water because he hasn't broken the surface tension yet. Really good timing on the photographer's part. And here's another picture of surface tension. I found that one too. I like that because that's our mascot. But anyway, yeah, an insect not floating, standing on water. Floating is different than surface tension. That's a whole different conversation that you don't need to know. But anyway, any questions about surface tension? All right, here's the important one in my book. This is the most important, in my opinion. Temperature. Water is really, really good at moderating temperature. Another thing you need to know, this is a new concept. It's going to, well, new to this course. You might already know this. But this is the first time I mentioned it in this course. Temperature is the measure of the motion of molecules. So when someone says, you know, I'm turning up the temperature in this room, when it comes to science, what they mean is they're making the molecules in the air speed up. That's what temperature is. It's measuring how fast molecules move. So if you turn the temperature down on something, the molecules are moving not as fast. You definitely need to know that. But anyway, water is really good at moderating temperatures because it's hard to change its temperature. It takes a lot of energy to do that. Imagine if I asked you guys, I'm not going to do this, but imagine if I asked you all to stand up and hold hands and say, all right, now dance. Just dance as wild as you can while holding hands, right? You can do it a little bit. You guys are stuck together, right? You're holding hands, so there's only so much you can do. But then eventually, if you get wild enough, your hands will stop holding hands. Then you can really go wild, right? You break dance like that. Ray Gunn, who's that girl? Yeah, from Australia. Did you guys see that in the Olympics? The break dancer. That was hilarious. Anyway, the point is, that's water, right? So water has these hydrogen bonds. So because of that, you keep adding temperature, adding heat, right? You're trying to speed up the molecules. The water, because of those hydrogen bonds, it's only so much it can do. It's just holding hands with the other water molecules. Until finally you get it so hot that there's so much energy, it breaks those bonds, and then the water molecules move crazy. But that's the point, right? That's why water is so good at moderating temperatures. How many of you have ever either do this or have seen it, where you have like a tea kettle of water, like you cook it on the stove, and then when you're done, you put the tea kettle on there? Have you ever done that? That's because water is really good at absorbing that heat because of those covalent bonds. This is why, for example, I'll do things like when it was really cold last week, I got a bunch of water bottles, put them outside and let them freeze because it was free and I'm cheap. And then I put those frozen water bottles into my fridge because water is really good at moderating temperatures. So now I've got a refrigerator full of frozen water, which really is going to bring my power bill down. Anyway, yeah. So again, for the exam, that's what you need to know. Water is very good at moderating temperature. Again, just for all these reasons I said, because you have to break those hydrogen bonds before it really heats up. This is why it takes so long to boil water. This is why, well, we'll get there. I'll come up to that. All right, so any questions about this slide? All right, again, water is very good at moderating temperature. And this is why on Earth, temperatures stay within limits that permit life. Without water, Earth would be too hot in some places and too cold in others. Actually, some parts of Earth are too hot and are too cold. But without water, the entire Earth would be like that, right? Too hot in some places, too cold from other places. So this is why, for example, I'll show you on the next slide. Here we go. This is a good example. So West Virginia is right about here. You can see that where I circled it. London, England, right, way up here. So it's a lot farther north, right? But if you were to look this up, did I use that as an example? No, I used Iceland as an example. Even farther north. So here's Iceland right up here. If you were to look up the climate in West Virginia and the climate of Iceland, they're very similar. Despite the fact that Iceland is way up there, very far north compared to us. But the difference is Iceland is surrounded by water. The water is very good at moderating temperatures. West Virginia is not surrounded by water, so we have bigger temperature differentials because of that, right? So we don't have the water. So water, or Iceland, like I said, you can look right there, very similar climates. So what happens, not that you need to know this, the water gets really hot at the equator, it's moving because of the way the Earth spins. Water moves this way, it hits South America, so then it has nowhere else to go, so it kind of goes up north. It goes up north, but it's still hot. And by the time it gets up to Iceland, it still has the temperature, it still has some of that heat that it got on the equator. Because of that, Iceland, again, has a very similar temperature climate than us. How many of you ever been to the desert? This one, okay. Which desert was it?
Like home, not Virginia.
Okay, so for you, was it really hot in the day and cold at night? Yeah, that's how it is in the deserts I've been to. And that's the reason why, because there's no water. So here in West Virginia, even though, again, we're not surrounded by water, but we have trees, right? There is water. So things get heated up. During the day, the water is absorbing most of that heat, so things don't get too hot. And then at night, it gives off some of that heat, so things aren't too cold. In the desert, when there's not as much water, there's nothing to absorb all that heat, so things get really hot. And then at night, there's nothing giving off that heat, so it gets really cold. Anyway, any questions about water moderating temperature? Let me put an X through here, just as an indication I'm not going to ask you any questions about Iceland or West Virginia or anything about latitude. And of course, another way that's important with water moderating temperature is we sweat, right? And when we sweat, that cools us off. So any questions about that? All right, let's talk about the biological significance of ice floating. Water is interesting in this way because usually, like I mentioned earlier, like temperature, when we say something's hot or cold, what we're really talking about is how much the molecules are moving. So as something gets hotter, the molecules are moving more, and generally speaking, things get bigger when they get hotter because of that. And generally speaking, when things get colder, they get smaller because those molecules are moving around less. And water is the same way to a point. As I'm sure a lot of you already know, when water gets really cold, it becomes less dense, right? When you get ice, right, it gets colder and colder. As it gets colder and colder, it does like everything else, gets smaller. But then once it freezes, it has this particular shape that just happens to be less dense than liquid water, and that's why ice floats. And you need to know that's why ice floats, because it is less dense. Ice is less dense than liquid water. And again, that's slightly unique because, again, most things, when they get colder, they get more dense. So that's the why. And here's a picture to show you the why. Right, here we have these. That's really hard for you to see. But if this was a better projector or if it was darker, what you could see is these water molecules are kind of like vibrating. In the picture, supposed to show them vibrating. You can't see it in this picture. But yeah, they're moving around. But then when they get frozen, obviously they're not moving around anymore. They're frozen. And they also make this particular shape. And because of that, it's less dense. And because of that, ice floats. So there you go. Now you know why ice floats. But I didn't explain why that's important. Why does it matter? Any guesses to why that matters for life? Nope. All right. Here we go. As the body of water cools, the ice layer that forms on top is basically like a blanket. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because you think ice is cold, because it is cold, but it's all relative, right? So think about, the ice sheets in the North Pole. It's cold, there's ice on there, but because of that fact, there's liquid water under that, right? It hasn't frozen because that ice on top is acting as a blanket. So while the air might be, negative 50 degrees, the water is not freezing because it has that blanket of ice on top. Does that make sense? I know it sounds weird to think of an ice as a blanket, but it is. It's cold, but it's not as cold as the air. So because of that, we have liquid water. If it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for the fact that ice floated on top, things would just freeze up and we wouldn't have life as we know it. And this is slightly related. This is not in your textbook. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it, but this is a great example. I used to live in Florida, and they used to, when they knew a freeze was coming, actually, I probably had that last week. Anyway, when they knew a freeze was coming, they would spray the trees down with water so that they would freeze. You would have a blanket of ice on these trees. And again, that sounds counterintuitive because, oh man, ice is cold. But that water, it's hard to change the temperature of water, like I keep saying, right? So that ice on there, yes, it's cold, but it's not as cold as the air. It's going to take longer for that temperature to get lower than it already is. Anyway, any questions about why it's important that life, especially that ice floats? All right, I feel like we should be able to finish this. This is the last portion of the water discussion, and we only have about 2 minutes left. The next word for attendance is cat. The #1 invasive species in West Virginia, cat. Anyway, some terms you definitely need to know. Solution, you need to know what a solution is. A solution is a liquid with a homogeneous mixture of 2 or more substances. Blah, 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 blah. A solution is when you mix some stuff together. That's what a solution is. I took this, I mixed it into that, now I have a solution. The thing that's doing the dissolving is called the solvent. So, if you take sugar in boiling water because you want to make simple syrup because it's time for a margarita, that would be, the water would be the solvent, right? The water is dissolving that sugar. The thing that's getting dissolved is called the solute. And it just so happens, when you're doing this with water, when water is the solvent that you're using to dissolve something, that is called an aqueous solution. So these are all terms you need to know. Solution, solvent, solute, aqueous solution. For this chapter, it's only slightly important, but later when you learn about osmosis and diffusion, these terms are going to be very important. So yeah, make sure you know that. Solution, solvent, solute. When you mix a solvent, when you dissolve a solute into a solvent, that is called a solution. And then again, specifically an aqueous solution if we're talking about water. So any questions about that? All right, water can dissolve a variety of solutes. It's really good. It's probably one of the best solvents we have, which is why it's important. For example, water dissolves salt, and we need salt, right? So that's sodium chloride right there. I don't know if you can see it, but we don't need sodium chloride. Your bodies need sodium, and it needs chloride, but it doesn't need sodium chloride. This is why the water is so important, because it needs to break those bonds and give us the sodium and the chloride. Yeah, we'll end it there. So I guess the last word for attendance will be salty. And that's it. I'll see you guys on Monday. Don't forget to do your pre-labs if you haven't already. And I will be online for office hours if you need me.
Is there any way I can show you proof that I put that in?
No.
Let's get it done.
Yeah, I wouldn't even worry about it, yeah. Again, I guess before I stop recording, just to remind you, for those of you in person, you don't have to send those words, but you can to get even more extra credit. For those of you online, you have to send those words. Actually, you know what?